habitat associations decades after fire. And just before I get started, I wanted to thank Camille, my advisor, who's just been amazing throughout this process, and my committee members, Dr. Jody Vogler, and then Dr. Paula Fornwalt, who is on Zoom right now. Just thank you all for the support you've provided me. So as I walk through my research today, this is just an overview of what I will share. First, I'll walk through the background information. So why is wildfire relevant to birds, and why do we need more research on birds anyway? Then I'll discuss more specifics about the 2 wildfires that I studied over the past 2 summers. So what data we collected, stuff about the wildfires, such as where they were, their forest types, the different field data collection we did, and then finally the statistical analysis that I selected. Then I'll get into my results, the discussion, and how this informs future research efforts. And then finally, I'll do a very brief conclusion and open it up for questions. So let's get started. To begin, I believe it's helpful to provide an overview of wildfire and how it influences avian habitat. So broadly, wildfire impacts wildlife in 2 ways, both directly and indirectly. Directly, you might think of something such as direct mortality during a fire event, and indirectly, which is what I focus on for my project, wildfire influences vegetation structure across the landscape, so thus creates a variety of foraging and nesting opportunities for various different bird species. The focus of my project specifically is on this indirect effect on bird species and their habitat associations based on how wildfire influences vegetation structure at different fire severities. So just briefly, a quick definition of fire severity. What exactly is it? Because I'll be discussing it a lot throughout this presentation. And so here, really quick, just fire severity refers to the effects of a fire on the environment, typically focusing on the loss of vegetation, both above ground and below ground, also including soil impacts. But what I've focused on is really that impact on vegetation above ground. So here's kind of how we classified the different sites. For high severity sites, it was evidence of total tree mortality from the fire. Low severity sites, and sometimes moderate as well, in those sites that had evidence of any surviving trees from fire. As far as looking at the way that wildfire shapes vegetation structure across the landscape at different severities, I find it easiest to think of this impact of wildfire severity at 2 different scales, both a broad scale and a more zoomed in scale. So at this large scale, which I'll discuss first, wildfire creates a mosaic of unburned, low, moderate, and high severity patches across the burned landscape. Areas which burn at low severity may, for example, clear the ground layer, but leave that canopy layer intact, whereas areas that burn at high severity result in total tree mortality and essentially reset the successional stage. So I really like this image that I've included, where you can see that patchiness of wildfire burning at different severities. So you may have an unburned or low severity area in close proximity to more moderate and higher severity areas, all within that same burned area. As a result, this creates a variety of different habitat patches across the landscape. So this spatial heterogeneity is also important for individual bird species who require different vegetation features at different seasons or times throughout their life. So I've included this figure from a publication. It was studying the black-backed woodpecker in the Sierra Nevadas, I believe, and it highlights this really well. So the figure shows different movement patterns for a species typically associated with high severity wildfire. However, researchers that looked at their movement found that fledglings actually utilized areas with lower burn severity or unburned areas in the first about 60 days of their life, where you can see those circles. They're in those areas that did not have much of a change in canopy cover. And then as they got older, past about 60 days of life, they started utilizing high severity areas as represented by those triangles. So this just shows how even for one species, the proximity of different burn patches throughout a landscape can be really important. This spatial heterogeneity is sometimes referred to as pyrodiversity, and pyrodiversity is the spatial or temporal variability in fire effects across a landscape. Many researchers have found that higher pyrodiversity leads to increased avian diversity, especially a decade or longer after fire, but lots of this has not yet been tested. So as I've stated in the other slides, this is because pyrodiversity leads to distinct habitat types across a landscape, and that can support hypothetically more bird species. So this figure to the right, where you've got that burn area, just shows areas that have a lot of different burn severities would have higher pyrodiversity, and then areas with predominantly low or predominantly high would have low pyrodiversity. So moving into a more finite scale, wildfire shapes vegetation structure, and this includes important habitat components for different bird species. So examples of the positive impact of wildfire of different severities include one that many might think of as in the creation of snags for cavity nesters. So snags are just dead trees, standing dead trees. Another is when it clears the understory, it can make way for shrub growth, which can be important for example, shrub nesters. And then another is when trees are burned in high severity areas. This can lead to an increase in prey when insects move into the burned area and come to kill those trees. And then finally, an open canopy after wildfire can actually positively benefit many species, such as different flycatcher species who have a better time looking for insects and foraging in those open canopy areas. So this is particularly relevant in southwestern ponderosa pine ecosystems, which is where I focused my study on, because of the historically mixed severity fire regime. In the Southwest, this mixed severity regime was composed of frequent low severity fires further downslope and moderate to high severity fires less frequently at higher elevations or in mixed conifer forests or in areas that have accumulated more fuel. So in these forest systems, there was also a wide variation in tree age, burn patterns, and as a result of all of this, different and wide range of habitat types suited to a variety of birds across this landscape. For example, estimates have shown that up to over at least 100 bird species utilize ponderosa pine landscapes in Arizona alone. So these habitats could support a wide range of species as a result, as you might imagine. So I've included just these 3 life history profiles for a few species that are common to these ecosystems, just to display some of the varieties possible and how different vegetation structures in these ecosystems can support different birds. So that top one, the mountain chickadee, is a cavity nester that prefers forests and higher canopy cover, whereas the mountain bluebird's often associated with burned areas. It prefers open woodlands, and it's a flycatcher, but also you'll notice is a cavity nester. And then finally, the Virginia's warbler is often associated with gamble oak in areas of dead ponderosa pine. Of course, these bird relationships to fire are not necessarily consistent throughout time. Vegetation succession occurs after fire, and this vegetation recovery has been widely documented in the literature as a key factor in what shapes bird response to fire. However, researchers have found that there's not a straightforward link between the years after fire and bird response. It's not necessarily linear, and it doesn't necessarily stay consistent across different ecosystems. So vegetation structure in different ecosystems may influence birds differently, and there's still much that's unknown and much that is left to be quantified. In addition, fire regimes in ponderosa pine ecosystems have shifted towards larger, higher severity fires, which may create novel responses to the response of birds to both time and vegetation growth, depending on how these ecosystems respond. A variety of causes have led to this, including land management policies, including fire suppression and grazing, all of which led to fuel accumulation. Paired with the effects of climate change, these factors have contributed toward larger and more severe wildfires. And I've just highlighted this quickly with this image right here, where you see from 1984 to 2020, an increase in the area of high severity wildfires in those southwestern ecosystems. So as a result of these shifting regimes and more high severity fire, the recovery trajectory is uncertain and may not follow expected historical patterns. Instead, these landscapes may experience wildfire-driven conversion, which I've highlighted with this figure. Conversion means that after fire, landscapes do not recover to pre-disturbance norms, so they experience instead long-term enduring changes, and as you can see in this figure, that could be to a different forest type, to a shrubland, or to a grassland. The arrows here just show those potential pathways, and the point is it's enduring, it's unknown, and there's very little research on how this impacts bird species. And conversion is, of course, you might guess, a risk to bird species because it eliminates habitat on the landscape, especially for sensitive forest species. At a large scale, it can even lead to a mismatch in climate and vegetation conditions, as displayed by this figure. So you'll see the climate niche represented by that blue box, and then the vegetation niche, and between those two is the joint niche, and as these become more and more misaligned, that joint niche can shrink. This is known as fire-driven niche contraction. So then, how does all of this influence birds in southwestern ponderosa pine ecosystems? There's not much research out there. There's been minimal research addressing the response of birds to fire in these ecosystems past about 10 years post-fire, and that's not even considering the role that the conversion, which I just mentioned, could play. Essentially, this is the why behind this study. There's been minimal research on the long-term response of bird communities. The biodiversity hypothesis has not been well studied, and these findings will help to inform what recovery may look like in future decades for frequent fire systems, whether following historical recovery patterns or otherwise. These findings can help managers predict species distributions and tailor management strategy, especially as we continue to see an increase in high severity fire across the landscape. So moving into the objectives as a summary of that, to design our study, here are the objectives I settled on. The first two are more community-oriented, and then the third is more species-specific to get at those species vegetation links and associations. So the first is to determine how avian species richness differs across low and high severity sites. The second was to examine how avian community composition and vegetation structures differed across low and high severity sites. And then that third is to quantify associations between frequently observed bird species and specific vegetation structures. Moving into the methods, I'll first discuss the fires and where we studied and the number of sites that we established. So here's just an image showing our overall study area with both the Hayman fire and the Poniel complex fire. So both fires burned through ponderosa pine and mixed conifer forests, along with some pinyon juniper for the New Mexico fire and some higher elevation forest types for the Hayman fire. This is the Poniel complex burn area, and so this began burning in the summer of 2002 in northern New Mexico. We established 30 high severity and 30 low severity sites, all on the Philmont Scout Ranch in New Mexico, though this fire did also burn on some other private ranches as well as through the Carson National Forest. Overall, the fire burned with 51% moderate to high severity, and you can see there the acres burned was 92,000. And then this is just all of the different sites we established. So the green is low severity and that reddish color is the high severity sites. Then in the summer of 2022, we also established sites at the Hayman fire. So here we established 30 high severity and 40 low severity sites. The Hayman fire, like the Poniel complex fire, began burning in the summer of 2002, this one near Woodland Park, Colorado. And instead of the 51% moderate to high severity at Poniel, it burned at 65% moderate to high severity. So all of the sites established were on Pike National Forest land, and this fire burned with unprecedented severity, and until 2020 was the largest wildfire in Colorado. Now it's the fourth largest wildfire. So prior research has documented low regeneration success at high severity sites as well. So moving into site selection, overall, I had 130 sites in total, the 30 and 30 at Poniel, and then 30 and 40 at Hayman. So these are just site selection recommendations based on common bird census techniques. All of our sites were at least 200 meters apart and 50 meters from active roads. They were only in ponderosa pine and mixed conifer sites, even though, like I said, there was some pinyon juniper and some aspen and some subalpine at Hayman. I wanted to keep it consistent and look at similar bird communities. And then I also avoided any evidence of planting because, for example, in the Hayman fire, some of the sites with a lot of planting, they was already up to about here, so you could imagine might impact the bird species in the mid-story. To conduct the bird surveys, so point counts, we followed recommendations from Ralph et al. Both 1993 and 1995 were immensely helpful. So we did 2 visits to each site and 8 minutes per visit, beginning at first light and ending within 5 hours of sunrise during the breeding bird season. So starting towards the end of May through the end of June, just to capture the most bird activity following these recommendations. We recorded all birds seen and heard within 200 meters, but then pared this down to only analyze birds within 75 meters. And then to further reduce detection differences between sites and across time, we did not conduct counts in inclement weather. So no anything above a drizzle. We did not do anything in high winds, and then also no snow, of course. This is just an example of a point count. My lovely artwork. Thought at this point I might need a breather. So when you conduct a point count, you just stand in a circular area. So you could imagine that being 200 meters and observe all birds with a binocular, writing it down on a data sheet. And then from there, I eliminated anything that didn't actually land in the plot. So if there was no evidence that the bird was actually using that habitat, eliminated it from the data sheet. Moving into the forestry measurements, we collected a variety of forest structure variables at every plot where we conducted point counts, and I wanted to do this to capture those immediate effects of habitat right where the birds were. So generally, these variables included aspects of the overstory, including canopy cover, tree species, tree size, and then in the mid-story, including shrub cover, and then finally understory and ground cover, and along with substrate. So this is just the big list of everything that we collected. Moving into the statistical analysis, I'll go by these based on each objective. So for objective 1, which I put here again just as a reminder, to determine how avian species richness differs across low and high severity sites 2 decades after fire, I first conducted a 2-sample t-test for the Hayman fire based on low and high severity categories, and then ran a 1-way ANOVA for the Poniel complex fire based on low severity edge, low severity interior, high severity edge, and high severity interior categories, along with low, moderate, and high shrub cover categories. So the reason for the difference here was I classified all sites as low severity edge or interior, high severity edge or interior based on a refugio layer that I borrowed from Walker et al. 2019. But all of the sites at the Hayman fire were considered high severity interior or low severity edge. So I ended up just having to group them into basic low versus high severity. For the objective 2 analysis, I examined how vegetation structures differed across low and high severity sites via Kruskal-Wallis tests, so essentially non-parametric ANOVA tests. And then to look at conifer regeneration across low and high severity sites, I ran a Fisher's exact test, which is basically a small sample version of a chi-squared test to look at the presence versus absence of conifer regeneration at sites. And this included pinyon, juniper, and ponderosa pine or Doug fir. Continuing on objective 2 to examine the difference in avian community composition, I utilized non-metric multidimensional scaling and created an ordination plot based on the dissimilarities between sites. And so when we get to the result, I'll explain how to interpret this plot. I then overlaid species vectors to understand which species at each site drove these distribution patterns. And finally, I ran a permanova to assess the differences between different sites of severity and see how severity could explain avian community composition variation. For the last objective, looking at those species-specific relationships, I utilized Wilcoxon rank sum tests, which you can think of as a non-parametric alternative to 2-sample t-tests, and I assessed relationships between species and vegetation variables. So following methods from a great habitat ecology book I read by Veach et al., I believe in 2021, I grouped sites into detected and non-detected for the most common species, and then analyzed these differences along a different, so for example, canopy cover as a variable between the 2 site types. This result allowed me to discern if there were significant vegetation feature differences at detected for non-detected sites for a variety of species. And then finally, I ran logistic regression models on the same set of common species. Logistic regression models use predictor variables to predict a binary outcome. So in this case, I tested a variety of vegetation variables and site or fire type to see if I could create models that predicted specific species presence and assess the relative importance of various vegetation variables. Moving into the results of all of this. So starting with objective 1, the results of an ANOVA on species richness for the Poniel complex fire are provided here in this figure. So as a reminder, HE stands for high severity edge, HI for high severity interior, LE low severity edge, LI low severity interior. So the results across all of the sites were highly significant. And then post hoc tests indicated that overall, high severity sites were significantly lower with species richness than low severity sites. There was not a significant difference between groups of similar severity. However, the difference between high severity sites was trending towards significant with a p-value of 0.07. And then finally, I did not include the plot for the difference between shrub cover categories because there was no significance between low, moderate, or high shrub cover for species richness. This is the plot for the Hayman fire. So similarly, results of the t-test on the Hayman fire were highly significant. There were significantly lower species richness at all high severity sites compared to low severity sites. And as I mentioned before, they're only broken into 2 groups for this fire. This is getting into objective 2. So this summary table is the result of my Kruskal-Wallis tests. There's a lot going on in this summary table, and I won't force us to walk through all of it. So I'll just list some of the highlights and go through it one by one. So results of these tests indicated that many variables were significantly different between low and high severity sites at each respective fire. So I've highlighted these in red. These variables included canopy cover, live basal area, percent bare ground / rock cover, and then 1,000-hour fuels. Low severity sites had significantly higher live basal area and canopy cover between the low severity and high severity at Poniel and the low severity and high severity at Hayman. So whereas canopy cover at both Poniel and Hayman was around 40% for low severity sites, it was still about 0% at all high severity sites. Live basal area was essentially 0 at both fires' high severity sites. There's a little bit at high severity above 0 because there was some aspen regrowth in some high severity. For bare ground and rock cover and 1,000-hour fuels, they were significantly lower at low severity sites compared to high severity sites. Overall, the Hayman fire also had additional significant differences between low and high severity sites for other vegetation variables that were not significantly different between low and high severity sites at Poniel complex fire. So these included snag basal area, which is just standing dead trees, which could be important for birds, which is why I quantified that, percent shrub cover, and then percent grass cover. And I quantified percent shrub cover at least 2 feet or higher to capture that mid layer rather than ground cover shrubs. At the Hayman fire, shrub cover, snag basal area, and grass cover were lower at low severity than high severity sites. Finally, overall, there was also overall higher shrub cover at Poniel complex fire sites, and you can see that 22 and 15% cover at their line at high and low severity sites compared to at Hayman, anything, whether it's low or high severity, was below 3%. Moving into conifer regeneration, so with the conifer regeneration results of the Fisher's exact test, I found that there was a significant difference between the presence of conifer regeneration between low and high severity sites at either fire. There were less signs of conifer regeneration at high severity sites across the board. Results showed that 43% of Hayman high severity sites had some sort of sign of conifer regeneration compared to 100% at low severity sites. While the Poniel complex fire had more signs of regeneration, with 57% of high severity sites having some sort of regeneration, 6 of those 30 sites showed only signs of pinyon juniper regeneration. And then finally, another interesting tidbit that I did want to point out is there was higher regeneration in low severity sites at the Hayman fire than at the Poniel complex fire. We had a couple of sites with over 1,000 seedlings, which took a long time to count and was very noticeable in the field compared to the Poniel complex, where it would be about 10 or so. So here are the results of the NMDS ordination plot, looking at avian community composition. As I mentioned earlier, NMDS plots show the distance between sites based on site dissimilarity. So in the case of the plots I created for these fires, the dissimilarity is based on bird composition at each site. So there's 2 axes here, but the units they don't represent anything. It's just representing the relative dissimilarity between sites and that relative difference. So sites are represented by the colors seen here, and I've drawn ellipses around them. And again, it's high severity edge, high severity interior, low severity edge, low severity interior. Then these labels you see with the species names are species that most significantly drove the distribution pattern for this NMDS. So these species with arrows that point in the same direction as a certain severity type are positively correlated with that severity. The longer the arrow, the stronger that correlation. So looking at the Poniel complex fire, what is immediately noticeable here is how distinct high severity sites are from low severity sites. They're really distinct on the graph. They don't overlap. And as we can also see from this plot, there are more species correlated with the low severity sites, that blue and purple. These species are driving the low severity site composition. They're typically forest and open woodland associated species. I won't read all of them, but some of them include the yellow-rumped warbler, the western wood pewee, the western tanager, and the mountain chickadee. We can also see there are fewer species correlated with high severity sites. So these species were typically desert, scrub, or grassland associated species, such as the rock wren, the Woodhouse's scrub jay, the green-tailed towhee, and the blue-gray gnatcatcher. Looking at the Hayman fire, these trends continue. So you can see again that clear distinction between high and low severity sites, and they're even more separate on this graph where there's no overlap between the ellipses. Again, the low severity sites had more species overall driving their distribution pattern, and they were again mostly forest associated and woodland associated species. So similar species here included the yellow-rumped warbler, the mountain chickadee, the western tanager, and then at the Hayman fire, the pygmy nuthatch was primarily a really dominant species at low severity sites. At the Hayman fire, the trends with high severity continued. Species again, such as the rock wren, green-tailed towhee, and brewer's sparrow drove that high severity site distribution pattern. The mountain bluebird and vesper sparrow aren't listed, but were also generally associated with high severity sites. They just didn't quite make, I had to cut down on all the species on the plot because it was overwhelming, but they were still significantly driving the species distribution. The key takeaways here is just that overall, more species significantly drove low severity site patterns at both fires, and these species were typically forest and open woodland species. High severity sites were typically correlated with grassland, shrubland, desert, or pinyon juniper woodland species. Finally, these are the results of the Permanova on site type for both of the plots. So Permanova is a statistical method to check if groups of multivariate data, in this case, the species composition at each site, are significantly different from each other based on some sort of grouping variable. So in this case, I compared groups based on both severity type and then shrub cover type at Poniel Fire. And then with the R² value, this shows how much variation in sites can be explained by that grouping variable. So for the Poniel Complex Fire, 22% of the variation in species distribution differences across all of the sites could be explained by splitting those sites up based on site type into low severity, high severity, low severity interior and edge, high severity interior and edge. At the Hayman Fire, you could explain 16% of the variation in species distribution across sites based on just breaking it into low versus high severity. As you can see by the p-values, these were both highly significant. Finally, when I tested the shrub cover group with the Permanova, it was not significant for the Poniel Complex Fire, explaining only 3% of variation across sites. This is probably because across the board, pretty much all sites at the Poniel Complex Fire had relatively high shrub cover. Moving into the species-specific habitat associations for the Poniel Complex Fire, there were 13 species for which I tested these based on species that were observed at least 15 times. So for canopy cover, most species tested were significantly positively associated with sites that had higher canopy cover. 9 out of the 13 species I tested had significant relationships with higher canopy cover. It was unsurprising that a lot of the forest-associated and woodland species, such as those on the NMDS plot that I've listed here, did have this relationship, though it was surprising for one scrub-associated species, the house wren, and the American robin, which is typically a generalist. Only one species of the Poniel Fire was associated with lower canopy cover. This is the dusky flycatcher, and it is a shrub nester, so this is not that surprising, and this is just it nesting in a shrub, in case you're curious. For shrub cover, surprisingly, only 2 species at the Poniel Complex Fire were associated with lower shrub cover, the western tanager and the western wood pewee. Both do prefer open forests and are generally forest-associated species. Surprising to me, at least, that the Virginia's warbler and dusky flycatcher did not exhibit a preference for higher shrub cover, likely due to high shrub cover across all the sites, as I mentioned in the Permanova. Moving into the Hayman Fire, there were more species here that I tested relationships on because there were 24 species observed at least 15 times. Again, canopy cover was still the most consistently associated variable with species. 11 out of 24 species exhibited a positive association with higher canopy cover. And again, just like the Poniel Complex Fire, most of these were forest and open woodland associated species, but I've listed some unique species that I didn't mention in the other slides, including the dark-eyed junco, the Hammond's flycatcher, the pygmy nuthatch, and the Townsend solitaire. At the Hayman Fire, some more species had negative relationships with higher canopy cover, and these were the mountain bluebird, the rock wren, the green-tailed towhee, and the dusky flycatcher. And you might be starting to recognize these species names, seeing them at the high severity sites in the NMDS ordination plot, for example. For tall shrub cover, the pygmy nuthatch, Steller's jay, and western tanager exhibited negative associations with higher shrub cover, and this makes sense because they're all forest or woodland species. The dusky flycatcher, green-tailed towhee, and rock wren exhibited positive relationships with higher shrub cover, as expected. So there's a green-tailed towhee nest in a shrub. For other variables, dead basal area and grass cover, which didn't really have relationships for the Poniel Complex Fire, there were some species relationships at the Hayman Fire. I was surprised, however, for cavity nesting birds, including the pygmy nuthatch and the western wood pewee, they were associated with lower dead basal area. They're cavity nesters, so I would have expected these relationships to be positively associated, but it's possible that the scale of the study masked this relationship. For example, the pygmy nuthatch territory is about 3 hectares, and I was looking at within 75 meters of an observed site. For grass cover, the green-tailed towhee and rock wren were associated with higher grass cover as expected. Moving into the logistic regression results. So finally, I tested these models for all of the same species that I've just mentioned, species observed at least 15 times at either fire. I've included here species that had models with an AUC of at least 0.7. So for reference, an AUC value of 0.5 means the model performs no better than random, and an AUC value of 1 would indicate the model performed perfectly. So typically people recommend about 0.7 as a baseline. We see here there were 8 species with AUC values of at least 0.7. Site type indicated low versus high severity, and site type and canopy cover were the most frequently included predictors that had the best performing models. So overall, there were 5 forest-associated species, 1 open woodland-associated species, 1 shrubland species, and 1 desert species with high-performing models. Interestingly here, this is where we see dead basal area having that relationship with cavity nesters. 2 cavity nesters did have dead basal area as a predictor and preferred higher dead basal area. Moving into the discussion, so why all of this is relevant. Overall, our findings about lower species richness at high severity sites reflect what was expected based on the literature, but it's exciting to see this trend hold in a landscape that has not previously addressed it. Previous research has shown a relationship between vertical vegetation structure and height and species richness. So greater vegetation height is theorized to support more species niches across different layers of the canopy. This is because it really provides different opportunities for different species to have more foraging and nesting opportunities at different vertical layers. While our results were not significant between high severity and edge, they were trending towards significant for the Poniel complex fire species richness differences. This warrants further study into patch effects within these ecosystems. Previous research from the Sierra Nevadas found overall lower species richness in high severity patch interiors. And our results, again, if you remember, the p-value was 0.07. So they warrant additional study to see if this effect holds in other ponderosa pine ecosystems. Overall, our vegetation structure and conifer regeneration differences for both fires indicate there are still significantly different recovery patterns at low versus high severity sites, and that these sites remained overall divergent in terms of vegetation 20 years post-fire. Additionally, avian community composition was distinctly different between severity sites at both fires. So this really highlights the enduring impact of wildfire on avian communities and reflects findings from other ecosystems which found divergent communities persist in ecosystems up to 50 years post-fire between unburned and different burn severity plots, as well as other findings which found that severity drove differences in habitat structures for decades after fire. Why is this relevant? Well, these distinctly different species trends at low and high severity sites, along with various general species at all of the sites, support several conclusions. First, these findings lend support to the biodiversity hypothesis in an ecosystem where this has not been addressed in the short or long term for bird species. While high severity remained an important component of the landscape, overall, low severity sites supported more species. Overall, a mix of severity is necessary to support the widest array of species across the landscape, but again, low severity was associated with more overall species, and a lot of the species there were forest and open woodland associated species who were not found at any of the high severity sites. Furthermore, canopy cover and severity were almost the solely important vegetation-related factors for species presence across the landscape. This indicates that both canopy cover and severity can be used to inform the likely distribution of forest and non-forest associated species 20 years post-fire in these ecosystems. Canopy cover, as stated previously, likely offered the widest range of habitat for forest-associated species, as well as opportunities for foraging and protection from predators. Both of these metrics can be used to predict the distribution of species post-fire and to allocate post-fire management actions. Finally, another important point is that our findings do indicate signs of conversion across the landscape, both reflected in the bird community and the vegetation community. At the Hayman fire, over half of high severity sites had no signs of any conifer regeneration, and at the Poniel complex fire, as you might remember, a little over half of high severity sites did have signs of conifer regeneration, but 20% of this regeneration was toward a different forest type, pinyon juniper. At the Hayman fire, these bird communities showed shifts towards grassland and shrubland associated species. So I've included here the Vesper sparrow, which is associated with grasslands, and the green-tailed towhee associated with shrublands. At the Poneal Complex fire, the bird community shows shifts towards both shrubland species and pinyon juniper associated species. So it was really interesting to see that some of the high severity species driving the NMDS plot were both the blue-gray gnatcatcher and the Woodhouse's scrub jay. Both of these are PJ birds. Moving into the management implications, these findings indicate that restoring or protecting areas with mature canopy cover is imperative for many forest-associated and open woodland species. Ideally, allocating prescriptions for thinning or prescribed fire to buffer forested areas that managers wish to protect is a proactive strategy to protect this sensitive forest habitat ahead of time. However, after fires, managers can also assess the overall proportion of different burn severities on the landscape and allocate planting efforts to large, high-severity patches, especially in those interiors that are unlikely to regenerate. Again, managers should not aim to eliminate the mix of severity across the landscape, but strike a balance between habitat recovery and enough forest-associated habitat since it supported the most species. Moving into limitations and then future research needs, the first that I would think of is detection probability, which would be important to include in future studies, especially for rare species. While we were careful to reduce these differences in our study to better discern relationships, for example, one forest species, the Grace's warbler, it's really common it's really rare in ponderosa pine ecosystems, and it was on the Poneal Complex fire, but just at a low enough rate that I couldn't model it in any of these tests. Additionally, abundance data could help to bolster findings about the difference in severity patches and to understand how richness findings relate to different bird diversity findings. Finally, future research could incorporate LiDAR and patch metrics to see specific habitat trends at finer scales or to capture, as I mentioned, those different edge versus interior metrics. Additionally, time periods such as 30 or 40 years post-fire could allow us to see how these trends progress in the future, especially as sites have shown signs of conversion to other landscapes. It would be interesting to see a decade from now how these landscapes are looking and what the associated birds are, and whether it's consistent or if different birds have become more common on the landscape. In conclusion, I'm just listing all of the summary of the study. So I mapped the long-term trajectory of vegetation recovery and avian community response to fire in landscapes that have not been studied, and this showed continued divergence and conversion. These results provided support for the biodiversity hypothesis, and both highlighted the importance of mixed severity across the landscape, but with emphasis on the importance of low severity sites to maintain habitat for both forest and overall greater species richness. Finally, we've highlighted canopy cover as a key habitat requirement, which can predict the presence of many species across the landscape and be used to guide management actions. So moving into just some fun photos from the field, I just want to thank my field techs. One of my favorite photos here is when we had multiple flat tires this summer. That's them changing the flat while I took a picture of them. And then just to thank many, many people. I really want to thank Camille. You've just been amazing throughout all of this. Thank you for giving me a chance in this field, for pushing me to be my best and just answering many, many questions and emails at all times. To Jody and Paula, thank you. Every time we've had a committee meeting, you've just helped so much and been so receptive and offered really nice insight. I really appreciate it. To the folks who made it possible to study these fires, Lee at Philmont Scout Ranch and Steve at RMRS. Lee actually saved us during our flat tire experience and helped us get up the canyon to get our stuff. And then Steve helped us spend the night at RMRS, even though we were not even studying that fire that week. So I just really appreciate both of their help throughout this and being so receptive to research on these landscapes. I really want to say a heartfelt thank you to my field crews, Allie, Alex, Sam, and Jamie. Jamie, you've been such a mentor and friend throughout all of this. You're the best. And you got me coffee for this. Allie was with me for both seasons and has been through pretty much every field situation imaginable. Alex and Sam are also equally great on different fires. Jackie, thank you for your one experience helping us in the field. I felt I had to mention. And then to all my current and past lab mates who have just been really helpful and kind and supportive. I just love the support our lab has offered. Thank you to my new boss, Courtney Peterson. Gloria, thank you for your mentorship here, and the CSU Stats Lab for reminding me my R code was not messed up. And then finally, thank you to Mikey, my family, and all my wonderful friends. I appreciate everyone putting up with me throughout all of this. And now I'll move on to questions. Thanks. Anyone in here have questions? I mean, it's great if you don't, but I
I have so many positive comments.
Oh, thanks.
Just make sure I'm not.
Just take up 20 minutes. Just kidding.
To preface some of my more scientific questions, I remember meeting Maria when she was getting interested in natural resources and fire and connecting wildlife. And I guess she found out about Southern Rockies Fire Science Network and came to me. We met on Old Town Plaza, which went into hours of conversation, which wound up at the Rio Grande in the afternoon, which was more margarita facilitated discussion, which I'm sure led for her for a positive experience in going into this group. But just the breadth and work that you've shown from being a volunteer with the Southern Rockies Fire Science, a very capable volunteer with the Southern Rockies Fire Science Network too. This is really commendable. But one technical question I do have is the similarities and difference between O'Neill and Hayman were really interesting. They were both at the same year, kind of similar montane environments, but the O'Neill in New Mexico has perhaps a higher monsoonal precipitation, what would you say, footprint impact. Did you see any differences in suggested species richness from there versus the Hayman? And also, it didn't look, other than I'm assuming the sparrow is an introduced species, right?
Oh, I'm actually not sure. The Vesper sparrow?
Yeah.
I'll have to check.
But it looked like my basic understanding of birds that all of these were native, almost all of them. So none of these environments are really being taken advantage of by invasive.
There was one, the brown-headed cowbird, I think, Allie, I feel like at all of our low severity sites, pretty much every site, we're like, oh, there's a brown-headed cowbird. So I don't think they're invasive. I don't remember, but they are parasitic. So they take other species nests and are a problem. And they were pretty all over the Hayman fire. I didn't look into the differences in the climates between the two, but I didn't compare species richness differences across the fires because I didn't want to make a statement like, oh, there's higher species richness at Hayman versus O'Neill and say it's because of whatever reason when it could be something like that. Similarly, like I had hoped to do something like with indicator species for pygmy nuthatch because the Hayman fire was everywhere and it had such a clear relationship with low severity. Then we got to the O'Neill complex fire and there were not very many of them. And I realized like, oh, there's other variables here influencing where these species ranges are and why they're the most abundant at different areas. So I didn't directly compare the differences. And I would think, yeah, maybe the climate would have an impact. It was very heavy rain while we were down there this summer. Yeah.
So your main message here for managers would be more fuels management or restorative environmental management and prescribed fire?
I would think anything to protect those low severity areas, specifically before fire if possible. So I've seen some recent research where you really buffer those areas through prescribed fire or thinning, or ideally both, to protect those areas and essentially before it's a problem. And then if you can not do that after fire, planting in areas which might not regenerate would be good. But I was talking to Courtney after my practice defense, and there's a good point with climate change. There might be different forest types in these ecosystems that do better. For example, O'Neill with pinyon juniper, it might not make sense to plant certain higher severity species if they're not going to do well. So just testing what would work would be helpful.
Great job.
Thanks. Laura.
What's the most interesting bird you saw?
Gosh, this is tough. And the easiest question is the one that stumps me. I just love pygmy nuthatch, and I know that they're everywhere, but they're just such an Allie's like laughing at laughing at me. I'm like obsessed with them. They're such a iconic bird for ponderosa pine forests, and they actually help each other with raising their young. So I like that they did cooperative breeding and nesting. Interesting species. I'm trying to think. Anytime I saw a mountain bluebird, really, western bluebird, those were pretty nice. Especially seeing them in high severity areas was pretty fun. Yeah. Yes.
For your NMDS.
Oh, yeah.
There was one low severity interior site, I think, that was like kind of over in the, and I was just curious if you like looked into what that site was. Or, like,
No. Yeah. I mean, some of them with Poniel, basically, like if you're looking at that vegetation structure table, there were not as many differences and the patches were generally a lot closer to each other, which is part of why I limited it to 75 meters because that landscape was a lot like there'd be a lot more edge area, just anecdotally, because I didn't analyze patch metrics, but I think it's really like most of them had distinct, like there was a distinct shrub cover with canopy cover at low severity sites, but there was some overlap when they would get into these edge areas where it'd be like low severity really close to a high severity or some low to moderate severity too. And I think that's most likely why. Whereas with Hayman, for the most part, were more distinctly different. You did get into some edge areas there as well with moderate severity where they'd start to look like a little bit of a mix, but I think Poniel, it's really just because a lot of the features were similar between the two, especially shrub cover. It was pretty extensive there.
Savannah online
Oh.
asks, interested in your insights here. There's some concern about the decline in PJ ecosystems in the Southwest. It's really interesting that PJ obligates and associated species did well in high severity fires. Could this be an opportunity for natural regeneration or assisted migration for PJ species into high severity birds?
Yeah, I was kind of lightly touching on that with Gloria's. I think seeing that PJ's naturally doing well here and some of the sites that you were on, even Camille, like there was pinyon and juniper previously. It was just dominated by either ponderosa pine or mixed conifer. So if it's naturally doing better and things are naturally moving upslope, it could be an opportunity to see like, oh, these species are doing really well. And there are bird species here who are, for example, the pinyon jay, another species that we saw at Poniel that could do well here. And it could be an opportunity to not be fighting against the climate, pretty much. Yeah.
I maybe have two questions.
Cool.
Steve with so is the actual mechanism that's like driving these differences where birds are like their nesting habits or?
I think and something that I've thought about a decent amount is like when I mentioned the woodpecker example, the thing driving the fledglings, the young birds, was survival from predators.
Okay.
Whereas when they got older and they had better survival techniques, it was foraging opportunity. So I think it can really vary, and it even might depend on the species time. Like it could be reproductive at certain times of the year, but it's hard for me to say across all the species what it is necessarily. I think nesting is an easier one to think of just for me, but it could be both. Yeah, with foraging opportunities with the canopy and yeah, or moving into the burned area with insects.
Anybody else have any question? I had a question about what you observed with invasive vegetation. I know you were focusing on the birds,
Yeah,
but you said the American robin is a generalist, right?
pretty much.
So what kinds of similarities and differences did you see? How many of the birds were all the birds omnivores in terms of diet? And I wonder how much invasive grasses and forbs dictated the distribution of the birds. Are they all seed and insect eaters? Or do some of them focus more on seeds and others on insects?
Yeah.
And was invasives impacting that? Not to suggest an entire new thesis.
Yeah, I was a little scared of understory stuff. I'd say for shrubs, it was pretty much mountain mahogany, gamble oak, wax currant. And then there was like yucca. I have no idea what the forbs were, I will be honest. But there was a pretty big wide, so even though I only looked at the species observed 15 times, I thought I might get a question about all the different birds. So I put all of them here where you can see all of their different foraging behavior, nesting guilds, habitat associations. So some of the like birds like American kestrel, you're getting the live prey, but then you might have the birds such as the black-headed grosbeak that would be getting insects, and it really varied. Broad-tailed hummingbird was all over the place in their nectar. That's just like a very brief, it kept going and going. This was my cheat sheet, so I just, yeah, it was a lot of species across both fires. And I just wanted to use these to highlight the differences in, you might have a species that's associated with forests, but it wants the foliage. And then you might have a different species, but they happen to be a ground nester, and just that wide variety where it's like, they're not necessarily overlapping in every single trait. I don't know how invasive plants would necessarily, I didn't see a lot of cheatgrass. I didn't see a lot of thistle. Yeah, yeah, I didn't, because I know cheatgrass from all of Jamie's sites. I didn't really see much there.
Thank God. Well,
Yeah.
that's probably because it's east of the divide and the precipitation regimes are a little different.
Yeah.
What's, foliage cleaning mean?
They take like insects off of the foliage, so the live canopy. Yeah. Yeah, they're like gleaning the insects. Yeah, like this robin.
So how do your results inform protected or sensitive species management? Particularly, I'm thinking the poster child is the spotted owl.
Yes, yeah.
And how those protections might actually, in the long run, hurt their chances at survival because we're unable to manage those forests under changing conditions.
Yeah.
So,
I think with birds, Mikey's heard me talk about this a lot with like different, sorry, a lot of different birds may be losing their habitat and not even be identified as a sensitive species. So I'm going to talk about the pygmy nuthatch again. It's projected to lose up to 81% of its range by 2050, and it's not even identified as a species of interest. So I think it's a big challenge, and it's going to be a big management challenge. And I think similar to watching lower elevation forest types move into burned areas, I think it's not really a one size fits all answer, and we might need to change how we think about species specific management, especially like, oh, it's an old growth forest, but what if that old growth forest is not going to survive in that area? I think it just really varies, and identifying more birds that are sensitive that we don't even realize at this point. Yeah.
You that are one of the homes.